Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on the video. Today, we are going to do a kind of a cool thing. I'm going to introduce you to Jeremy O'Connell with CyberWeb Solutions. He is in Atlanta, and this is the first time that I have done an interview format podcast kind of thing here on the Easy Linux channel, and I'm hoping that this is going to be the beginning of a new thing. Maybe we'll start doing more of these and talk about all kinds of groovy stuff all the time with all kinds of interesting people. So Jeremy, go ahead and say hello. Make sure your microphone's working.
Hello, gang. Joe's invited me onto his channel here, so we're going to see what happens.
Now, me and Jeremy have been working together in the background for a little while now. He is the one who is responsible for putting together and setting up all of the back-end infrastructure for the new Easy Linux webpage. And one of the things that we have been working on is lots of folks send me requests all the time for help with their computers, and most of the folks I talk to are those who want to get Linux going on their local desktop, just like at home. But I have also been getting lots of inquiries from people who want to start it in small businesses and offices. So one of the things that I have been doing is if somebody comes along with a question that is more server related, more enterprise related, I kind of bounce it over to Jeremy. Hence the name of this video, which is Mr. Desktop and Mr. Server, because I concentrate on desktops and Jeremy concentrates on servers. So let me go ahead and give him a chance to talk a little bit. I'm just going to ask him to kind of tell us a little bit about himself. You guys that have been watching my channel know who I am and know what I'm all about, but this is really about Jeremy today. So the first question I want to ask you, Jeremy, is what is CyberWeb Solutions and what is it exactly that you do?
Well, thank you, Joe. One of the things at CyberWeb is we actually eat our own dog food. I mean, we're not just solely focused on helping companies with IT. As you can see on your screen here, there's BlissPlan, and that's probably our biggest site. Really, it is our biggest site. So I'm in charge of keeping up with the infrastructure for that, the servers, which is obviously Linux-based, and things like the web server itself and database, all that. So I have constantly been experimenting throughout my life with running different websites, what works, what doesn't work. And so that's given me a unique insight. And then I do programming as well. So I am able to set up things like WordPress and even do custom programming. So I do help companies out, but I actually run the stuff I talk about.
Yeah, let's break that down a little bit so that people understand, the Linux side of things. And that is, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure that you manage and what solutions. I know that we've talked many times on the phone. We usually get into these monster conversations, and Jeremy likes to talk about servers. He likes to talk about file systems. He's a big fan of ZFS, and he's also a big fan of CentOS. So talk a little bit about the actual infrastructure that you manage, and then we'll get into the programming side of things a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Originally, if you want to go a little bit further back, I actually started, since you mentioned that, with Solaris, and obviously that's not open source. Well, I should say, obviously, some people might not even know what Solaris is, and that's a proper Unix. And eventually I moved over into Red Hat Enterprise, RHEL, and then from there into CentOS. And that's today what CyberWeb Solutions across all our servers currently actually run CentOS, and obviously Linux-based. And you have mentioned that yourself, Joe. That's what runs Easy Linux as well. And so that's the main Linux part of it. And then we have web servers such as Nginx and other things that actually serve the pages.
Right. And then the other part of what you do is talk a little bit about the programming side of things, because before I let him talk, what he does is really interesting, because what he ends up doing is writing very specific software for like a particular business or office or application so that one program can talk to another. So get into that a little bit.
Sure. Middleware, as it's called, when you need to have program A talk to program B, and you need some type to get data, some type of data exchange between those two. And so I've done a lot of middleware in my life. I have had to put together one script needs to talk to another script. And so, yeah, for example, I'll just give a real world example. We have used fulfillment centers in the past for some of our physical stores, and I needed to have our e-commerce shopping cart, which was third party, and that shopping cart did not talk to the provider to do the fulfillment center side of things. So I had to program software that would, when an order would come in, would automatically, without any intervention from anyone at our company, tell the fulfillment center, hey, ship this package. And then once the fulfillment center did everything they needed to do, the middleware would grab the shipping info or tracking number, like FedEx, UPS, whatever, and then send that back and update the database, as well as send an email to the client. And that was all hands off. And that's what middleware is. So again, we've worked with a lot of shopping carts, and I've ended up doing a lot of programming, including with WordPress. I have actual plugins in the official WordPress directory, which you can go find. Search for CleverWise if you're interested. They're free, open, all that. And so I have tools that I have to use to solve real world situations. And then I'm constantly learning. And then other people will come through the various shopping carts and said, hey, I noticed you're posting a lot in the forums. Can you help us out? And so that's really how I grow. I don't just sit there and say, I'm going to program this for some company and not really know what it's doing just because I'm programming. No, again, as I've said, I'm eating my own dog food, and I have to get a lot of systems to interact with each other. And so that's what middleware is, if you're not aware of that term.
Yeah, that's I wanted you to explain that a little bit, and broke up just a touch. Broke up just a little bit at the end there.
Oh, okay. Well, again, it's just middleware is simply, it's pretty much what it sounds like. You have application A and application B, and they don't talk to each other. There's no way to exchange data. Again, like as I just said, we have a shopping cart over here, software A, we have the fulfillment center, software is B, and there's no connection between the two.
Right. And so that's I think that's a very interesting thing to do. And so the point of that is that I think that Jeremy has a really interesting perspective on making the tools out there, whether they be open source or not open source, putting them together in such a way to get them to work. And so, yeah, tell me a little bit about, you said that you came from the Unix side of things. You were using Solaris. When did you start getting interested in what was going on with Linux, and what was your opinion about it back when you were doing the stuff with Unix and Solaris?
Well, originally, when my first website that I actually hosted, I mean, I go so far back that as a personal site, I use GeoCities, and maybe some of you listening remember that. But my actual first commercial website that I was in charge of, I started right around the end of 98, beginning of 99. And ironically, that was with Linux because of the hosting provider. But when I actually got more serious and was like, we need to turn this into a real business, I went to a web hosting provider that was Solaris. And Solaris is proper Unix. And so from that point, I did not like actually what was in Linux, because Linux was considered the poor man's Unix. And so Solaris was very powerful. It still is. And it had a different architecture, and I won't get into all that. You can research that if you're interested in it, but it just ran differently. And so you could do things with Solaris that you couldn't dream of in the Linux world back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So to answer the question you asked, when did I start running Linux? Because from then on, it was virtual hosts with Solaris. Then in 2001, we started running dedicated servers, which were full Sun microsystem servers running Solaris, and did that probably up until about 2008. Then we switched to Dell servers, Dell Blades. That's what the hosting provider was providing us with, that were dedicated blades running Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And so we actually had a subscription to go get into that. And I think Joe's touched lightly on Enterprise Linux. And then we moved over to CentOS. Now, between that, I ran projects, programs, whatever, because we're constantly experimenting at CyberWeb Solutions. I mean, we've run websites, little mini sites. We've had feed systems that I custom programmed. We've done all kinds of things like that, taught auction courses. We've done a lot of different things online, but I've constantly been experimenting. So even when we were running the Solaris side of things, I still usually had a server or two off in another data center, even in like 2005, 2006, that was actually running Linux, and it was running the CentOS. And I won't get into all the different companies because I doubt you care about that, but I just started experimenting, and I started liking Linux more and more. And then quite honestly, what killed Solaris for me in a lot of ways was, if you recall, some of you may, Oracle bought Sun. And then I said, that's it. I don't want anything else to do with Solaris. I've definitely been using Linux for a while now, and then I just went all into the Linux operating system on servers.
Yes, and I switched it. You're out of presentation mode just to have something different on the screen. We decided when we were discussing doing this that we were not going to do video with webcams simply because of the fact that we kind of want people to watch it. And the other thing is that we decided that that would be best because then we didn't have to clean up and shave and actually look presentable. We can sit behind microphones, so that's why we're doing
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
We were like we started out and we were like looking at it, and he says, I need a backdrop. My office, it really doesn't look good. And I went, well, wait a minute. And I said, well, I was going to do mine in the kitchen. So behind me, if I was on a webcam, you'd see my refrigerator. So we gave up. So it's not the most visually interesting video in the world. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty cool. That was so you started in the late 90s. The first time that I saw Linux was at Gateway Computer in Hampton, Virginia, in the computer lab. They had one machine in there that was running Linux, and it was Caldera, Open Linux. And so I went out and bought a book and started learning about it. And then for, I would guess, the next, well, let's see, let me figure this out. So from 98 until about 2007, I was managing Windows networks and high-end automation systems. When I say high-end, I mean just kind of exclusive, esoteric stuff that you find in radio and television stations. So I was always learning about Linux in the background, but I actually did not start playing with it and really looking at it until 2007 because I was too busy with the Windows stuff. So actually, Jeremy, you got something on me because you've been around it for so long using it on servers.
Well, yeah, and actually, if you want to not go past the server thing, in high school, I was buying SUSE. You could go buy it in places like CompUSA. I mean, I was buying that in like 95, 96, 97. I would bought several versions. You go get the actual box and like 6 discs or whatever. So if you count my Linux exposure, it really goes back to probably about 95, 96, somewhere in that range. But I wasn't using on servers at that time because I was in high school and I was doing that and just playing with it. I had an extra computer, just threw it on there and played around with that.
So what, I know that you use CentOS for the server side of things. As a matter of fact, I know that's what we're using for the back end of Easy Linux. So it's pretty cool. But when you're playing around with Linux on your own personal machines and in the lab there, what do you play around with?
Well, when it comes to anything desktop, I'm definitely a Ubuntu Mate fan.
Yeah, and that's what he's using right now, but he's not sharing his whole desktop. He's just sharing his browser.
Correct.
Yeah, but I do know a secret, and I'm not going to tell.
Yeah, he knows an inside secret, so.
Maybe at the end of the video, you'll have to stick around. I'll tell you the secret.
Yeah, that'll get you a little carrot there to stay at the end of the video. Then he can release it.
Yeah. So we also talked a bit about using setting up Ubuntu on servers a little bit, which is something that I actually get a lot of people who ask about that, and usually I don't comment on it much in videos simply because of the fact that most of my videos are for newbies who want to do the desktop, but I do get a lot of questions about the server. And so tell us a little bit about your experiences setting up Ubuntu servers.
Yeah, sure. I have some experience setting up Ubuntu servers, and we actually run a Ubuntu server in production. Most, as I said, all our web-facing servers at this time are CentOS, but we do have a backup server that runs Ubuntu. And the reason being is because it backs up using ZFS. And right now it's a big hassle to get ZFS, which is a file system, if you're not familiar with that, to work on CentOS. It's possible, but it's just not worth the effort. And since Ubuntu is supporting ZFS at the company level, Canonical is, we actually run Ubuntu, but it doesn't run any web servers. Its sole function in life is simply stock Ubuntu, the ZFS module in there, and then it just rsyncs everything. And so I have worked with clients that run Ubuntu. I am, as I said, more of a fan of the CentOS side because you get much longer support, and it really just runs like a tank. And it's really hard to break CentOS unless you do something. So Ubuntu is a little less forgiving in that manner, and they abandoned their their actual distro is a lot faster than CentOS. But I am familiar with it, and it does work. And I'm in no way saying that you shouldn't run it if you're interested. But I will nudge people more towards CentOS if they ask me.
Yeah, for a server type application,
Correct.
because it does make sense, and depending on what you want to do, and so yeah, we were talking about that and talking a little bit about desktop cycling. And one of the things that we have had a conversation with about is kind of an interesting idea is I think that me and Jeremy both actually, to tell you the truth, are a little bit disgruntled with the state of desktop Linux at this point in time. And so we have actually said, you know, it would make a really cool desktop, I mean, super stable, if somebody would actually do it, is to come up with a CentOS based desktop that actually had the updated programs, but the really stable base, you know, like he said, CentOS, they will actually update things for 10 years. So that's one of the things we were talking about, is getting CentOS, coming up with some kind of system where people could use that on their desktop and have that real stable base.
And not Fedora people. I understand there's Fedora. We both do. But Fedora is a mess. So, no, Fedora doesn't count.
Fedora moves a lot. It moves very quickly, and it's like you have to, you know, redo everything every 9 months. And that's no, you know, I think people that want to use Fedora on a desktop are those who like to be out there on the cutting edge anyway. You're probably using CentOS or Red Hat elsewhere, and so you're familiar with the system to begin with. So we're not knocking Fedora. It's just for a, I guess the best way to put it is a consumer grade desktop, maybe not the best idea out there. I mean, take CentOS and then kind of do what Linux Mint does on top of that. I think it would be kind of cool.
Exactly.
You have any, we're gonna get some people putting comments on that when they're
of course, and they're going to be Fedora people. But the thing is, it's what Joe and I were talking about. Most people don't, including myself. I need a workstation that I can depend on. I can't reload it every 9 months. It's just not. I mean, I have too much going on, and I have to maintain servers and so forth. And I just, even with my knowledge of troubleshooting and doing things like that, and generally I can solve most issues, it's just not worth it. I can't. And that's one thing that I think, if Linux is going to get more mainstream, your average person isn't going to want to sit there and say, okay, 9 months, I already have to redo it, unless there's some type of upgrade path. If Fedora or whoever could say, okay, yeah, we go from Fedora 23 to say 24, and you hit this big shiny button, and then it just takes care of everything, and it works, then fine. But if you have to nuke and pave, I don't care if you put home on another partition, you're not going to get people coming to Linux. And I know Ubuntu's better about that and its derivatives, but that's the thing. What most people are going to want is they're going to want to install something, and then when the OS needs updating, I mean a major update, not just update a library and do the general everyday updating or whatever, to go from version A to B or whatever, you need a way that is very easy for people to do. And if you don't have that, and that is something Linux is missing, and we criticize Windows, and I'm not a Windows fan, but let's face it, a lot of people can upgrade from one version to the next, and it works. Generally better if you redo it, but still it works more often than not.
Yeah, and that's something that like Linux Mint has been working on, is they do have an upgrade path in place where you can go from Linux Mint 17.3 to 18. I've only tried it in a virtual machine. I haven't gotten a lot of response from people who have done it themselves, even though I did a video and showed you how to do that. And that is kind of an issue. And of course, on the flip side of that are rolling releases. Like you're talking about things like, like Manjaro and Arch Linux, and they're rolling. And I think, Linux Mint Debian is a semi-rolling release at this point. It's not really a rolling because it's based on Debian Jessie, but you are supposed to get updated packages if you install the back ports and all that stuff. And then, of course, there's Jeremy's favorite distro, which is OpenSUSE, and they have the tumbleweed. Tell us about
a joke, folks.
Tell us about OpenSUSE. Go on, Jeremy.
Well, I know that there's some people who like running it. I don't know why you would ever run OpenSUSE, but there are some podcasters and others who are really, really like it. And if that's your thing, obviously you feel free to run any Linux distro you want. I can't stop you anyway, and I wouldn't. But I think for most, especially when we start talking about easy Linux clients, again, the bottom line that most people want even as I said myself, I need a workstation, and people need something that's going to be dependable and work. And the OpenSUSE people, and I'm not just trying to single them out, but since Joe has brought them up, they break things. And then they use things like, you may have heard the Butter file system, which just came out recently with major bugs in it that could really crash your data. So they just make, in my opinion, very, very poor choices.
Yeah,
So,
ButterFS, that's what he's talking about, which if you install OpenSUSE, that is, and you select the automatic partitioning, then it offers to create ButterFS for your home directory. And then this is about a couple of days ago. I mean, what was it? 2 days ago, it came out that they said that essentially that all the code in ButterFS has major issues and it all needs to be reworked. Did you see that?
yeah, it's actually their RAID. Well, we're getting a little bit technical here, so I understand if your eyes glaze over, but it's just their RAID 5, RAID 6 code. So that just provides additional backup safety to your data, and basically, just in layman's terms, it copies what's on one drive to another drive. And if you want to know more, you can research it. But they said that whole code is just not ready for production, and it wasn't just some unknown third party that was criticizing it. These apparently, I'm not very intimate with the people who make it, but the actual developers were saying, some of the developers were saying, this code is not production ready and you should not be using it. And when it comes to your files, your data, your pictures, your Word documents, wherever you're using, you want those to be there. The last thing you want is to turn on your computer and just the file system say, I don't know where anything is, and it's just all gone. That's a nightmare.
Yeah, that's kind of insane. And of course, now people who watch my channel, usually they know what ext4 is. I mean, we have a mixed bag. We have newbies, and then we have people who are more experienced in ButterFS. They're trying to improve on ext4. They're trying. You can do a lot with it, but ZFS is another one. Then that comes to us from the Wild and Wonderful. That comes from Solaris, correct?
Yeah, originally, and actually, I ran that when we were running the Solaris machines, and we actually had dedicated Solaris machines starting in 2001. And there were times we had a lot of standalone Spark. They don't use the x86 architecture that most home users are familiar with. The software would not work on that, but they introduced, actually, Sun acquired ZFS, and then they worked on it, and then they came out with it. And I started running that actually on our Solaris machines about 2007 or 2008. And actually, I have a server at home that is a Solaris machine that runs ZFS as well.
Yeah, ZFS, it gives you lots of, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's a file system that you can put on your hard drives, and it gives you a great deal of options as far as you can take snapshots of the entire system. You can, it's pretty awesome. We haven't really gotten into that on the channel, but those of you who are more savvy know what I'm talking about there. So hopefully, I was kind of really hoping in Ubuntu 16.04 that ZFS was going to be mainstream, but it isn't. And by the way, up on the screen right now, for those of you watching the video and not just listening, there's the article in Wikipedia about ButterFS. So I threw that up there just so you guys could take a look at it. BTRFS, that's how that is. And if you want to learn more about it, you can check it out, and it'll explain, what that is. So
exactly.
Yeah.
I do say, for those who are more advanced, just if you're looking, I understand there's a lot of newbies, so this is a pro tip, but if you're someone who is advanced and you're looking for the best data protection, you cannot beat ZFS, period.
Yeah, and that was one of the things about Ubuntu 16.04 I was a little bit disappointed in, was the fact that I thought that was going to be, when you installed it, it was going to be on the drop-down menu there for the installer. It's like, what what file system do you want? No, you got to actually set the thing up. So anyway, that's a topic for another day. We could do a whole video on that if anybody's interested.
Exactly. They kind of misled people on that, actually. Yeah. They kind of made it sound like it would be a mainline thing you'd be able to do, like Anagros or something does.
Well, they were just so busy trying to get that project done for Microsoft.
Well, I think actually, if you look at it, that's a part of it. But I think the biggest thing, and I kind of agree with this, is the whole Ubuntu touch. And I applaud their efforts, because I'm so sick of Android, and I wouldn't touch iOS, at all. So, and I just offended a lot of people, I know, but there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. However, I want an open platform to run on a mobile device. So they're really the only company or group that Canonical, and I think a lot of their time and resources went into Ubuntu Touch. And then for some reason, Canonical says we have to get something out at X date, and they make some arbitrary date for themselves and blast it out there, and then they're stuck. And then they just threw Ubuntu 16.04 out there, and they weren't really ready.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that, I don't know. There's something that went crazy with that, and I've commented on that in videos. Is just that for those of you who are new to the party and don't know what's going on, Ubuntu 16.04 in beta was wonderful. The beta version of it was just unbelievable. And then when they got to a place where they were ready, the official release date came, and literally, if you downloaded Ubuntu 2 days after the official release date and got that version of it, it was loaded with issues. And there's they've made a lot of people in the community unhappy at this point, to tell you the truth, because of that. But they have fixed a lot of that now. 16.04.1 did come out earlier, late in July, so that one seems to actually work most of the time, maybe.
Yeah, usually. Well, I have family that runs it on hardware, not at a VM, but just straight on hardware, Lenovo hardware, which I'm not a fan of Lenovo, but it runs great. It runs rock solid, Ubuntu Mate. They never had any wireless issues with 16.04 or 16.04.1. They don't have any video stuttering. They've never had any problems on hardware. So I'm one of those people that believe hardware makes a big difference. But I will make one little addendum to you. I don't think it's fair in a way to pin everything on Canonical. If you look at it, Debian's starting to have some of those same problems, and that's upstream. I think part of it is Debian too.
Yeah, it was a lot of that was upstream. A lot of that, I mean, I think some of it wasn't necessarily under their control, but
no, I don't give them a full pass. Don't get me wrong.
No,
some things were Ubuntu.
My jerk knee reaction to it is that I really think that if they're going to call something an LTS, it ought to work, and it ought to be
exactly.
I mean, they could have held it back. So they supposedly fixed everything by the end of July. They could have held it back and said, everybody stay on, 15.10 and 14.04 for a little while longer. Hold on, when we release this, it's going to be really good, and it's going to work, So anyway.
And a little bit to your server question, to the Ubuntu server, that's what makes me a little bit cautious of even running Ubuntu server. It's pretty rock solid, but when you see that even on the desktop side, what code is it directly in the Ubuntu server that's shared with that? So again, that's why I will generally nudge people more towards the CentOS side, because CentOS just runs. Again, it's built like a tank.
Yeah, I've got the Ubuntu touch page up here. I'm just trying to put something visual on the screen, just in case. I know that a lot of people who watch videos like this, they don't really watch it; they just listen. But if you are looking, I've got the Ubuntu touch up on the screen, so you can actually go learn more about that. And if you're not familiar with that concept, you're one of the newbies here. Ubuntu, or Canonical, the company that distributes Ubuntu, is working on integrating the Ubuntu operating system pretty much on every device. They want it on a desktop, they want it on a tablet, they want it on a phone. So there's a lot of work going on in the background to get all of those things to come together. And you'll be able to plug your phone into your computer, and then they talk to each other, and it syncs up, and it's really amazing some of the things they're working on in the background. So that's why the Unity desktop has not gotten that much attention in the last 4 years.
Well, they really want that out there, and they really want to have, because they know there are millions of people that don't want Android, and I'm one of them. We want to be able to load something that's more open, that we understand, and Android really is. It is Linux based. It's its own distro, but it's heavy in Java, and so it's quite a mess. And so I'm one of those people who does not want a lot of apps, and you may be yourself. So if you are, you just need like an email program, a web browser, obviously phone texting, that type of thing if it's a phone, and then do maybe some YouTube video, obviously, to go watch Easy Linux. Then I think the Ubuntu Touch can serve millions and millions and millions of people. They're not trying to supplant iOS or Android, but Android's a closed walled garden, really, and it's getting worse and worse every day.
Yeah, it's pretty much all of the systems like that. Is that's one thing that me and Jeremy have in common. We actually, we're not going to get into it in this video today because it's sort of an introductory thing, but we don't necessarily. We have different points of view on a lot of things, but one thing that we agree on is that open source is a better solution. And so therefore, you're talking about Android becoming more of a quote unquote walled garden. Like that would be like, Mac is doing the same thing. You know, I've got a friend of mine who is a Mac head. He totally got off of Windows years ago, and all he owns is Macs. Now he wants off of that because he's so upset about it. And of course, most of the folks that watch these videos, they're kind of, you know, they're more on the side of being anti-Microsoft, probably not as staunchly anti-Microsoft as I am or you are, but you know, they understand. It's just the whole proprietary system just seems to be, it's like falling apart. And so this is where, at least in my opinion, I think Jeremy would totally agree with me. I think that open source is where it's at. I think this is where the development's going to be. And I think that especially for any handheld device, tablets, phones, direction.
I agree. I think though, one thing that we in the Linux community need to watch out is there's nothing wrong with proprietary in certain situations. I think if the OS itself is open, that's really the single biggest piece of the puzzle, because obviously any OS, it talks to everything, all your hardware. It obviously has to interact with your RAM at a very low level. So that's the most critical piece of software. But I see a lot of people in the Linux community who are just pure open source zealots, I guess you could say. And I am not. I think we do need to, in the Linux community, start like trying to get Adobe into it. And I'm not saying I'm an Adobe fan, but there's people who could do their workflow on Linux if they had the Adobe suite of products, or at least a lot of them. And there are a lot of Linux people who are like, no, never, because it's proprietary. So I think that there's room for companies to come in, and Joe has touched on snappy packages and flat packs, and I think that will make it easier for some of the software in Windows world and in the Mac world to move over into Linux, and then some of the people on Windows and Mac ecosystems can slide over into the Linux ecosystem. So
I think Snappy and app images, but in particular Snappy packages, they are going to, I mean, if
revolutionize. Yeah,
a lot of people don't realize that we're on the edge of a revolution, and there's a lot of people that are sitting there going, well, you know, I really don't like this because it takes up a bunch of hard drive space, and Snap packages usually contain their own libraries and all this other stuff. But my opinion on it is that, you know, there was a great, if you can find it, Linus Torvalds did a talk to the Debian developers. This was a long time ago. It's been maybe a couple of years now. I don't remember when it was. And they were actually quite hostile to him at that particular thing. It's quite interesting to watch. But one of the things he pointed out is that, you know, the idea of the Unix way of doing things, where you have all the programs talking to each other and working together, is great as long as everybody holds up their end of the bargain and they update their packages. And he said, you know, that was one of the things he said. He said some of the libraries in Debian were quite old and they didn't get updated and all this other stuff. And so he said that the way that it was is that he wanted a monolithic block of code that was going to be the program. And that monolithic block of code would be shipped to every distribution or every platform that you wanted it to put on. And that's kind of almost like what Snappy packages do.
Yeah, I agree. I think Snappy is going to win that battle. I mean, you kind of have a battle of Flatpak, Snappy, and there are a few others. But Canonical, to its credit, invited a bunch of developers and is putting a lot of attention behind it. So you can obviously read a lot more than we'll get into. But I think Snappy will revolutionize it. And some people out there may be wondering, if you're new to Linux, there's a lot of software, but why don't I see some of these? You know, I'm used to using a Corel product, or I'm used to using some video editing. That why isn't my video editor there? Why is it only for Windows or Windows and Mac, or just Mac or whatever? Why can't I use it on my preferred, or Linux that you're leaning towards? And one of the big hurdles that a lot of these companies have, because I recently saw something where Adobe was asked, it was their biggest post in their forum or request for new features. I don't quite know. I don't really follow Adobe, but I just saw this little blurb that was saying is I had like 16,000 requests to get Adobe products onto Linux. And Adobe was acknowledged that it was by far the single biggest request for any features or new. But one of the hurdling and stumbling blocks, if you will, and hurdles that these companies face is, even if they're going to get on Linux, what version of Linux? Because you have RPMs out there, you have debs, then you have, of course, the whole Arch way of doing things, and it goes on and on and on. And
well, the problem is, I mean, it's not just that. I mean, because it's like what people don't realize is that, you know, Google amazes me because they are able to distribute Google Chrome in 2 packages. Now, I don't know how they pull that off, but they really do it. I mean, it's because if you go to Google Chrome and you're going to download it for a Linux box, you're either going to get an RPM that is for, like Red Hat based Linux, or it's for OpenSUSE, or you're going to get one that's for Debian, and it works on everything. Now, how they do that, I don't know, but they do it, because it doesn't matter what you're running. You can just download that and then you install that package. But the problem is that if you take a company like Adobe that has a huge amount of software to deal with, I mean, they've got a lot of software, and it doesn't matter whether you like Adobe, and it doesn't matter whether you think it's bloatware, and it doesn't matter. We're not even talking about, proprietary versus open source, or whether they want to charge for it. We're just talking about from a completely technical point of view. Okay, so we want to port this over to Linux. Not only, okay, so you could say, well, we could make it available for Ubuntu. Well, there are 3 versions of Ubuntu that are currently supported. I mean, we've got 12.04, 14.04, and 16.04.
Exactly.
And it's the same thing with like Red Hat based Linux. We've got Red Hat. We got 2 different versions of that. We have CentOS. How many versions of CentOS are currently being supported?
There's actually, 6 and 7, and 5 get some limited support as well.
Yeah, so we have 5, 6, and 7. That's 3 there. And then, of course, anything that works on Ubuntu works on Linux. What's really interesting to go to is go look at, well, actually, I will do that. I will go look at it, and you can talk a little bit more on this. I'm going to go find this page so I can show you. If you go to the VirtualBox page and look at the downloads, okay? So yeah, let me go see if I can find that real quick, and then we'll talk as we talk here. But there's
that's
so
the
many
thing.
different. Yeah,
you have multiple versions, and like you're saying, subversions inside this, or point releases, I guess we really should say, inside each one. And it gets very difficult for a developer like Adobe or whoever to go, because a web browser is a complicated thing, but it is nothing like Photoshop. I mean, that is far more complicated. So it's just, they don't know what to really code for it. And so you could get more workload onto Linux, which a lot of us listening to this channel at least have some bend towards Linux, or you wouldn't be listening to Joe's channel. So that's why you may be seeing that, or that is why you're seeing it. That's, you may be wondering.
Yeah, and that's the reason. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to, because a lot of people ask that as well. And then, I'm looking at their download page here, and it just there's just, I'm trying to find the one for just where it says Linux hosts. And let me see here, because I think the user manual, VirtualBox older builds, sources. Anyway, there's a link here that I'm not seeing because I'm trying to keep my head far away from the microphone. I don't want to be like up on top of it, but it's just, you'd have to see how I've got this set up. But yeah, there's just a whole bunch here that.
Well, that's a question, like you said, I'm sure you get a lot. And I've talked to people about running Linux, and they're like, well, can I run X program? Like, can I run MS Office? And it's like, well, no. But I would like to see more. We'd all like to see, or that favorite game you may have like, oh, I want to run whatever. I don't know. I'm not a big gamer. So, and why is that available for Linux? And there are several reasons why. I mean, a lot of it's just developers aren't paying attention to it, quite honestly. But at the same time, even if a company says, I will create of something for Linux, then they look at it and they're like, oh, there's so much split in this whole ecosystem of Linux. I don't know. And they throw their hands up and they're like, forget it.
Now, here's the page I was looking for. I don't know whether you can see what I'm seeing, but we're just looking at the build for the current one, which is 5.1, or actually the one back before, because I clicked older builds. Look at all that. We have 2 different architectures for all of these different kinds of Linux. And then on top of that, they offer the source code. And the thing that happens a lot of times, and I don't know whether you run into this or not, Jeremy, but I do, is that you get somebody.
CentOS 5 still on there, by the way, because it's still supported some. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, it is, as a matter of fact.
Go ahead.
It is there. CentOS 5 is here.
Because it's still supported lightly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But anyway, now what I was going to say is that I run into this all the time, is where somebody will say, well, I have to use this particular piece of software. And what will end up happening is that they will go to the website and it's not packaged. So what they end up with is, I mean, you got some newbie who has no clue how any of this works, and they go to a page, for some reason they need this piece of software, And the developers have not put them in deb files. They're not in RPM files. They're not in anything like that. It's just, here's the source code. Have fun. Do you ever run into that on the business side of things?
Sometimes, but honestly, not so much, because at least on the server side, most of the software you need to run is going to, for example, like a web server, PHP or something like that's already in either RPM. It's in the repos really. And if not, then for example, I will use, as I've mentioned, Nginx, just a web server, and they actually, you can go straight to them and they have RPM packages that they release, or deb packages or whatever.
Well, I just add that on there. I just say that because of the confusion, you know? I mean, it's like,
Oh no, I understand. I'm just saying from the business side, generally most business software. But if you talk on the, like the business desktop side, then sure, there's software that it's just source. You need to, they give you the source, like you said, because the problem for them, which some people might not understand if you're new to Linux, is it's very difficult. And I can't speak from experience here because I've never released software that needs to be compiled for Linux. That the actual old way of doing it, that Snappy packages will change, and potentially Flatpaks, but we've already said it, we think Snappy is going to win in the end, is that you have to go through this really convoluted process of packaging it for a deb file. And then it's not good enough just for deb, because you have to have deb 32 and 64, and then which Debian are you're doing it, and then they have to go through all the Ubuntu, and like Joe just showed. And so you end up, someone sits there and spends their life just packaging this, and it doesn't take 2 minutes to do it. It takes a long time to package all this stuff, and it's just not worth it for most projects to do it.
yeah, and then you have to imagine what that's like for somebody like an Adobe to do that with so many different products, and they have to, you know, they're trying to keep up with all of that anyway. So yeah, it's going to make it a lot easier. And you know, my hat's always off to the companies like, for instance, like TeamViewer, which is a proprietary piece of software that you can actually download and it will install and it works. And they do put it into a deb file. I think they provide an RPM as well. I'm not really sure because I'm always using the Debian side. So anytime that I come across a company that does that, I'm like, well, thank you very much, you know, because that is an extra step for them, and they take the time to do it. So this is going to make it a lot easier to get software on Linux, and that's something that we're looking forward to. So let's go ahead and change the subject just a little bit and move off in a little bit of a different direction, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the when we were talking about Easy Linux and talking about getting people started with Linux, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your experiences already working with some folks, and there's some examples of how Linux kind of saved the day, or open source. You know, you walked into a shop that was Windows or some other system and made that kind of thing happen.
Well, probably the most recent thing that comes to mind is actually, it's slightly different, but it's Linux based. And I had a chiropractor who actually needed to show up on their screen some Kairos TV type service that their clients would see these rotating screens go by. And when they talked to the company that puts it out, they were like, oh, go get Chromecast and buy this and buy a router and connect a router to your desktop and then set up another wireless. And they were going, what the, these may be like you listening to this recording, that what does all that mean? And if that went over your head, exactly, that was the whole point. So I said I could help them out, and for a lot less money and a lot better solution, I use something called a Raspberry Pi, which is just a little teeny tiny device you can buy. It's like a little mini computer that fits in the palm of your hand. It has HDMI and all that kind of stuff, and Bluetooth. And so I just put Ubuntu Mate Raspberry Pi edition on there, something Mint does not have, as far as I'm aware of, a Raspberry Pi edition.
No, I don't think there is at this point.
Yeah, and so I just put Ubuntu Mate Raspberry edition on there, and it open source obviously, and saved the day for them, and that way they didn't have to deal with all, and it was its own computer, so they didn't have to take one of their workstations which has client data and medical data on it and try and put some crazy Wi-Fi thing on it and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah, so it was a one, here you go, this will do this, and you didn't have to put all this other quote unquote proprietary stuff together. I mean, it's just like a Pi with that running, and that's very cool. I get it all the time from people who just I got a call earlier today from my mom, My mom had been running Windows 7 for a long time, and she doesn't do much. She does email and she does web. That's it. It's like Facebook, email. She doesn't do anything else. And she called me today, and one of the things I've been getting on her about is that in her email account, she had like 700 emails sitting there. And I was like, Mom, you really ought to go through this and figure out what you want to keep and delete it and kind of organize that. And she called me this morning and she said, I would have never been able to do this on Windows 7 because it was so confusing where to save the attachments. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, when I did it this way, all I had to do was save attachment, choose the folder over on this side, click. And I said, yeah, it's pretty simple. It's laid out. And I get it all the time from people who tell me once they get used to using the things that are Linux based, and probably your chiropractor with his Raspberry Pi will say the same thing. It's like, oh, this is so much easier. Thank you. It's simpler.
Well, yeah, exactly. It replaced a Logitech, one of those Logitech TV appliance boxes that was like $200 or whatever. And they were telling me, they were saying this is so much easier than, because it's just stock Ubuntu Mate. And so they just open up a web browser, and I made it really easy with the icons, and I just told it to automatically go to that page, and it just made it really simple for them. But so really, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go on.
Well, I think a lot of people, to answer your question, in business don't even understand where Linux is saving the day for them. It's sort of an unsung hero behind the scenes, and a lot of companies will go get a website and they don't even realize they're running on some version of Linux. Usually CentOS, if it's just shared hosting where you just go buy an account for $5 a month, but it sometimes is Ubuntu. But if you're using cPanel, it's CentOS 99% of the time. So I think Linux is just sort of behind the scenes, and a lot of people don't even realize your little wireless router you go buy, your little D-Link or Linksys that you plug into your network. So Linux is in our lives, and a lot of people don't even realize it's there.
So what the thing is that what we're trying to do is just bring it into it. That's one of the things that I get into about security with people all the time, is that they're sitting there going, well, Linux, is it secure? Do I need antivirus? Blah, 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 blah. And, they get very uptight about it. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, do you have any idea how many things that you depend on every day run on Linux, and how secure it is, comparatively speaking, to some of the more, the proprietary systems? And they don't get it. They think it's some kind of new off in the corner thing. It's like, no, this runs your DVR. This is running Facebook. This is running Google. This is running your web page. If you're a business, probably, just like you said, it's totally there. What the thing that it has not gotten, in a mainstream sort of way, is that when people think of a computer, I think probably about 90% of the people out there, they automatically think they have two choices: Windows, Mac. That's it. And there's this other thing out here. Yay! It doesn't work for everybody. You might need a Mac, you might need Windows, but for a lot of people that I work with, it does. And exactly. So that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, it's in so many devices that you may not be aware of, you or your family members or friends, that it's won the mobile war. iOS is like a FreeBSD based, which is another Unix type system, and Android is a Linux based OS. So Android is about 85% of the worldwide market, somewhere in there. And so it won that. I mean, Chromecast is again going to be that. And like you said, I don't know of any router in the world, to my knowledge, that runs Windows. It's all either Linux or some Unix based, like a Cisco. You may have heard that term. But yeah, your little home router sitting next to you while you're listening to this, by the way, or connected to and listening to this easy Linux recording, is going to be going through some type of Linux base.
Yeah, it's
as well as like Nest and some of these other things for your smart thermostats. It's everywhere. It's the unsung hero that most people don't even realize how much Linux is powering their world.
Okay, so what I want to ask you is, I've talked on this channel over and over and forever about how you can use Linux in your home, and you can put it on your computer, and you can read your email with it and do all that other stuff. Take a couple of minutes and tell me, I'm going to give you a scenario and see what you can come up with, where you have a small office, and let's say that you had a small office with 10 to 15 machines, and they're running like Windows, and maybe they have just a typical setup, maybe one server and that sort of thing. How, if they came to you and said, okay, look, we don't want to do this anymore. Our equipment's getting old. We don't want to upgrade. We don't want to pay all this money for new licenses, that sort of things. What would you tell them at this point in time?
Well, obviously, will be some of the factor because some hardware is more capable than others. But if as long as it's going to run Linux, and most hardware will, but you do sometimes get some weird situations. I would definitely tell them I'd listen to what they need to do because that's the bottom line. As you said, if they're they're a business that's very pro graphic, they may be so plugged into certain tools it would not make sense, at least at first. But if they were ready to make the switch, then I would, once I evaluated what what do you have to do? And that's the bottom line. What do you ultimately have to do for your business? That's when I talk to businesses, I have to ask first. So the thing would be then to get them set up on desktops, obviously, and then, which is pretty easy in most situations, and make sure that they can store their information on a central file server. And in any situation, you don't want to upgrade all the systems at once. You'd want to upgrade a few and let them test it out, and then make sure that behind the scenes, generally swapping out, as long as they're not using Active Directory, you can generally get things done pretty easily by swapping out the Windows server behind the scenes. So part of it obviously is going to just depend on ultimately what they're using. And if they're using Microsoft Office, for example, because they've got Word, Excel, that type of thing, most of those applications and files will carry over fine to LibreOffice. The only thing I haven't seen that carries over very well is sometimes some really advanced spreadsheets that have all kinds of macros and super heavy algorithms won't carry over to LibreOffice. But in general, most times things seem to just work in LibreOffice. And that's generally what most companies care about. Then they have like QuickBooks or something like that. But you know what I've honestly found? More and more companies are going online with that. They're using QuickBooks Online. So obviously it's just a web browser. And in a lot of ways, the desktop is not really that important as far as what specific software you run, since so much you go to Facebook, well, that's online. You check your webmail, well, that's online. You know, again, a lot of companies are going to QuickBooks Online. Well, that's already, I just said, online. So it's really that a lot of the interaction is very heavily into the online, or cloud is kind of the current term for that, is going to the internet. So I would just evaluate them and just see. And in a lot of cases, it's not that difficult to get most companies over. It's better if they have a server or two they could spare, so they could run their Windows server and say have one machine that could be turned into a server, so you can kind of slowly migrate them off. And slowly could be just a few days or maybe a week or two. And sometimes companies are like, look, I want to test this for a month and see how it works. We'll just convert 2 machines and see how it goes, and that's fine. Because as you said, Joe, you don't have to buy licenses for Linux unless you want to go the Red Hat route and be able to call them up or get straight support. But other than that, or Canonical, you can obviously get support from Canonical, but you have people like Joe to help on that, much cheaper. And you have, other individuals. Because I mean, Red Hat's like $400 a server, which isn't bad because you're getting support straight from them, but that's not actual calling them up. That's just a standard license, you do it yourself type thing. So it's out there, and that's something I think people fail to realize. They think, oh, Linux is this, there's no real big companies behind it. Well, Red Hat is a $2 billion company, and Canonical is not exactly small either. Yeah, they're not Microsoft size, but they're not tiny with 2 people working in the basement at Canonical either. So there is a lot of commercial support behind Linux as well.
Yeah, I mean, some people seem to think that as a matter of fact, I had somebody say this to me that well, businesses don't want to use Linux because it's the wild, wild west and there's no support.
And that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, as you pointed out earlier, all of Google's servers, at least all the core ones, run Linux, and they experiment at Google, so they might have FreeBSD or something else going. But when you go to google.com, you're being served by a Linux, and they have their own. They don't run, just so you know, that they hack Linux and make their own distro basically. And then Facebook is running, so all those Facebook servers, and Amazon is running Linux. And then those companies have to create, once again, tools for themselves, and some of those they turn right back into tools to the community. And just to kind of point this out, Walmart, it was just recently discovered that I heard about, I should say, that Walmart said, we're tired of just having our point of sales, well, some of their software, that we don't want to maintain this just for us because we would like to get the benefit of open source. So they're actually going to make that open source for anyone to use because they want others to contribute, so it makes them stronger. And so Google does the same thing. and actually contributes to Linux itself as well as others. Not Microsoft. Well, Microsoft's actually getting more involved in Linux too, but Facebook again. And so these companies do actually run Linux, and then they create actual enhancements that we get to enjoy as desktop users or smaller businesses, because these bigger companies will have a need. They solve it, and then they don't want to maintain it all. So they're like, here, Ubuntu, or here, Debian, or whoever, you have this code because we want it just in there, so we don't have to keep having our guys recompile the kernel and putting that back in there. And that's actually happened several times.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of things that Google does with Linux to get things working on the Chrome OS will trickle back to Linux, because they do open source. What is it, like 90% of that?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number, but it's a very high percentage, because again, it actually helps to have more eyeballs on the code.
Well, exactly. And the other thing is that we're getting back to what Microsoft you were talking about they are just, it seems like every time you turn around, you hear bad news about Windows and you hear good news about Microsoft releasing something else for Linux. So I have actually postulated in the past that they would, at some point, we would have MS Linux.
I think that's a very real possibility. I mean, obviously there's no way to know 100%, but I think that I would be shocked in a way if in 10 years from now there isn't, because they could put a custom GUI on it. And if that happened, that'd be awesome in a lot of ways for the Linux community, because they wouldn't be able to hide as much, just spy on you as much. But second, just imagine all the software to run Windows would have to be ported to run on Linux. So there would then be no barrier for people to leave that, and they wouldn't be able to misbehave. Microsoft couldn't misbehave as much. So I think if you look at them integrating the Bash shell, if you look at them, they're going to be releasing .NET next year to run on Linux. They're going to be releasing, I think it's next year as well, I forget the exact date, but they're going to release MS SQL Server for that. So that's never happened before. It'll run on Linux as well. So they're beginning to release some of their applications. They've clearly lost the mobile war. I mean, who uses Windows on any type of tablet? Or, I mean, yeah, there are a few. They've lost that battle. They're not in things like the Pi. They're not being used much for DVRs, a little bit, but most companies aren't. You don't see them for any of these Internet of Things devices that you may be buying, all these smart devices or looking at them for your home. They're not running Windows. They're running Linux. And so they're losing the embedded market. And so embedded, just so you know, is things like you buy a DVR or you buy a Roku, and you know what operating system is on Roku? Well, it's Linux. You just use it as a home user, and it's running Linux under the hood. And so it's not Windows. And so Microsoft is really losing out there. And so games now are going to be less thanks to technology like Vulkan. So I think that in the long term, Microsoft isn't going to have much choice but to do something with their OS. It's really it's become this pile of useless bits, really, and it can't get a lot of things done. And then you hear about the anniversary updates causing all kinds of problems. And now, to Microsoft's credit a little bit, I do have to say no OS runs on as much hardware as they do. I mean, they have just about every combination out there you can imagine. So to that point, they run on all kinds of cards and all that, but it's just a mess. It's just, you have to go find drivers somewhere, and then you have to hope the company's updated the drivers to work with your version of Windows. And then there's, how many driver updates do you get on Windows? It's like all the time, especially for video cards, you have to update your drivers, and generally it's not worth it. And then your video quits working properly. So yeah, I agree with you on that, Joe. I think at some point they just keep trying to integrate more and more Linux, and you can run Ubuntu programs straight now on Windows 10, at least some of them. It's kind of the reverse of what you may have mentioned, Wine, in the past, which is a way you can run Windows programs on Linux, at least sometimes. Microsoft seems to be trying to do that in reverse.
Yeah, they do. They seem to be doing that. And the other thing is that 5 years ago, it would have been said that finding drivers for hardware was really difficult for Linux. And today, that is not necessarily true. It's a lot better than it used to be. And through Easy Linux, I end up trying Linux on a lot of people's hardware. And what I have found is that I'd say 9 times out of 10, it just works right out of the box, and I don't have any major issues with it. One of the big things with Ubuntu 16.04 was that the AMD drivers were not going to be available, and a lot of people were nervous about that. And then AMD came along and said, no, use the open source drivers. They're just as good or better than what we can give you. And I found that to be kind of interesting. I still haven't heard the upshot on that, whether AMD is actually going to try and introduce proprietary drivers for Ubuntu 16.04 based stuff or whatever the deal is. But they're like, the open source drivers are just as good for right now, that sort of thing. And you're seeing that all the time. And what really bugs me is people who will say, well, I can't use Linux because it doesn't work with my Wi-Fi card. And I'm talking about like a dongle.
Yeah.
And I just kind of look at them and I go, okay,
those are cheap and you can buy them all over
those
the
are
place.
cheap and plentiful. And the other thing is, well, I have a Lexmark printer from 2003 and Linux doesn't work with that. So I'm not going to use it. So I'm going to stick with XP. And I'm like sitting there going, printers are, you can pick up a printer for $30 that works with Linux. It might not be the best printer in the world, but if you just need to print, there you go. So what you're saying is that you're trying to avoid paying, let's say, $150, $200 to Microsoft to upgrade the machine, or possibly even going out and buying a new machine, and you don't have the, $600, $700 to do that. But you won't download an operating system that's absolutely free and then go out and buy an HP printer or a wireless dongle that'll work with it. It doesn't make sense, but people think that way. It's like, no, just buy one that works,
Exactly. And I have found, just for the record, you probably know this too, but Canons work really well and Panasonics work well with Linux. And I would just like to also point out a little pro tip, and this is not a technical pro tip, but this is just what I tell friends and family, and I do for myself. Most people shop on the printer price alone. They go to Walmart or Best Buy or whatever's available in your country or in your area, and they're like, hey, a $35 printer. If you will do yourself a favor, if you research what you're looking for and see what the ink costs, because it's not uncommon that $65 printer may be twice the cost of the $35 or $30 printer, but the ink is a half or a third of the price. So most people buy solely on the printer, and then they're like, oh my gosh, the ink's like $30 for all the colors. If you bought the other one, you may be able to get it $15 or $20. So Look at the ink cartridge price as well. Don't just shop solely on the cost of the printer.
Yeah, that's how HP makes money.
Oh yeah, they discount their printers really heavily, and then they gouge you on the ink. Now you can there's sites you can go to and printer stores that you can get that cheaper. But for example, you walk into Best Buy and it's like, oh, this HP is like $40 and the ink is like $50. And it's like, but if you bought, the Canon, it was like $80 for the printer, but the ink was, $25 or whatever. So don't just shop. Like I said, a lot of people just do it reverse of what I really recommend. Because I was looking at lasers one day for our company, and I bought a laser printer. It was $50 more, but I can get a laser cartridge for $16 that will print thousands of pages versus $80 or $90 for an HP. Although the HP was cheaper, but then it was like $80 for the HP toner, which was worth it to pay the extra $50 for the printer up front. And then I save on the ink. Toner, as it's called for lasers, every time I buy toner.
Yeah, and the thing that I do is just, I just tell people all the time, buy HP, because those are the ones that just went through this with my mom, because the printer that she did have was a Dell printer from 2009. And I don't even think that they have drivers for that printer that work on current versions of Windows. She was on Windows 7. Now, it could be, I don't know. You might be able to put the driver disk in. I didn't try it. But it definitely did not have any Linux support. So we just went through the process of getting her a printer. And it was just amazing to me that we bought her an HP. She wanted a scanner, the whole 9 yards, pretty high-end printer. And I just plugged the thing in to the computer and opened up the little applet to set up the printer. Oh, it's already set up. It just
that hasn't been my experience. Well, I should say, for business we do network stuff, but I know that the Canon and Panasonic printers we have, I just installed the driver from Linux, and well, actually I had to download the driver from Panasonic, but it worked. And then it's a multi-function. It worked right away over the network.
Right,
I can scan, print, all that. And it was no big deal to go get it.
No, I'm just talking about USB, just plug it in the machine. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah. No, I understand. Yeah.
boom, it just that, you know, and we even, and the thing is that if I had done the same thing on a Windows machine, then I would have had to use the HP disk, and then they load it up with so much junkware that
Oh, I know. You need like a a 10 meg file for your driver for your printer, and you have to download
exactly.
like 149 megs for everything else.
Yeah, and then they put all this other crap in there where it's like, you know, where you can go buy the ink and all that stuff. I mean, I'm not faulting HP for it because, hey, I mean, that's how they're doing it, but it just there's so many more hoops to go through, and it's just getting to the point now where once you get, because I know a lot of people who watch these videos, and if anybody stayed with it this long, a lot of people who watch my channel are on the edge. They may have a Linux machine running. They may have a laptop. They may have used it. They may be using it for their media server, but they're doing pretty much in their business and their home, they're doing a lot of things with Windows. And, you know, once you get away from that environment, the more you get into this, you look back on it and you go, why did I put up with that crap to begin with? It's just unbelievable. It's a simpler system. It makes more sense. You know,
and there's more help.
There's more help. It's easier to do. This is something that you can do on your own, and it might be a little bit mystifying at first, and you might be like, well, what's going on? But, you know, after a while, it starts making sense.
Exactly. I find actually the people who use it, my friends and family who've actually sat down and used it, are Windows people. And really the vast majority of times, all the times, I have to say 100% of the times, they're like, this is so much easier. And then they go back to Windows and they're like, no, I want Linux. And some of them are in the process of trying to get there because certain apps, and you do have to find what works for certain situations. But yeah, they just say, hey, it was so much easier on Linux, and I want that. And the people of my friends and family who have switched, none of them I know of have wanted to go back to Windows. Not a single. They're all like, I'm done with Windows. Forget it.
Yeah, no, I don't have anybody that I think I've had over the last 2 or 3 years since I started doing the Easy Linux thing where people can contact me and I help them get started. I do know of about 2 people that have said, I can't make this work, and went back to Windows. And the reason why, I know that the reason why one of them did it was because they were nuts.
Well, games is one thing, and that's going to change, folks, because
you know what I say? Hold on, before you get into that, and I want to let you talk because I have a new outlook on that, because I hear that all the time. You know, man, I'm playing my games on Windows. I can completely understand. You're totally into a game. It's not available on this platform. I say, fine, get yourself a Linux machine and do everything else, and then take that Windows machine and strip it. Take off everything that you don't need and just use it to play a game. And then start looking at games on Linux, and hopefully you'll kind of migrate yourself over. You know what I mean? But I just wanted to say that because I don't think I've ever come out and said that. It's just, you know, fine, keep your Windows machine, play your games on it, but move everything else over to Linux where it's more safe and more secure. Now, your take.
Well, I agree with you there. I think if you have the money and you can afford it, obviously you're better off having a dedicated game machine if you need. And I understand that. I mean, there's some business software that is Windows only, and if your business relies on it, well, you have no choice. At least maybe you can. Sometimes some businesses can have a machine in the corner that still runs Windows for that some application, but sometimes they want off of it. And you were asking me, and I've had some consultations where it's like we have 5 people and they all have to have this, and there's just no option. And I'm like, well, you can try Wine, but it doesn't always work, which is just a Windows emulation. Well, it's not really an emulation, but
Okay.
We won't get too technical on Wine, but basically it's trying to pretend like it's Windows. And so there are just certain situations. And I mean, I understand that. Or like you were saying, I've got to have Diablo 3 or some game, and it just isn't available and that's just my thing, or whatever. I don't know. I'm not a gamer, so in any way, shape, or form. But what I started to say is Vulkan is just a piece of software, and I won't get technical with it. You can research it if you want, or ask us if you want more details. But Vulkan is a piece of software that now was about somewhere around 24 companies came together, including Microsoft, AMD, NVIDIA, companies like that, and they released the code. So now if you're sitting on Windows, you'll see Vulkan drivers. I don't care if you have an AMD card, you have an NVIDIA card. If you look in Linux, any major version of Linux now has the Vulkan drivers. what that's going to allow companies to do, both for gaming software and even like Adobe, if they wanted to, or whoever, then it's an open platform that developers can actually code and write their software to use. And then Vulkan in turn will talk to the operating system.
Yeah, it'll work on anything.
Yeah, it works. So as long as Vulkan's supported, and it's supported on everything, it's supported on BSD, it's supported on Mac OS, it's supported on Windows, it's supported on Linuxes. So developers will be able to write a game, say, that will run, and as long as it's coded for Vulkan, guess what? It's going to work on Windows, it's going to work on Linux, it's going to work on FreeBSD, it's going to work on whatever Mac OS. And so you will start seeing more modern games. It'll take a few years because the average modern game, they say, takes 4 or so years to come out. Although with Steam, in all fairness, Steam, a lot of those guys get games out faster than that. But if you go search Steam, for example, you'll see they have something around 1,400 games for Linux. And I'm not saying they're all like, I can't throw any names out there, all like, what's that, Grand Theft Auto type games. I'm not saying that, but they're not all like text-based games either. They recently released like, what's that, Laura, Tomb Raider recently, 2 or 3 years ago, came out, and that's got heavy graphics and it works on Linux. So
yeah, it depends on the hardware too, you know.
Yeah, it does. Well, it does. And I agree with what you're saying. If you can afford it, use Linux in your main secure for web browsing and keep it up to date. And then if you can have a Windows platform system that runs only Windows that you can do for your gaming, like you said, strip it down, only use it for gaming. A lot of games now need online stuff, like SimCity still needs an online component. At least so I hear. I don't know. Again, I'm not a major gamer. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but at least when it first came out, the latest version, it needed. So run your games on that. Only use it for gaming. Don't use it to do your online banking or typing Word doc or your word processing, and then go to your Linux machine. But I understand, people have set budgets. They can't afford it. And sometimes you're just stuck on Windows for now. And if you are, I feel for you. I understand. I mean, that's just the way it goes.
Well, the flip side of that is that a lot of people, you have multi-computered households now, and you have people that have, what I run into is that a lot of people that I talk to and help to get started on Linux, they have a machine that they're currently using, and then they have one they did use. And so that would actually be, if you're doing gaming and you bought a machine that was powerful enough to do it, then that's a really good opportunity right there. Take that second machine that you're not using that wouldn't play your current game, and then use that for learning Linux and moving over to it, and it's a much more secure environment. And we have gone way over the half hour that we had intended originally, but I did have one more question in my notes that I wanted to ask you about, because I wanted your comments on it, and then we'll just kind of wrap things up here. Because we do this, we get on the phone, we're supposed to be talking about work, and we're supposed to be, okay, the Easy Linux page, and it's like, okay, we really have to talk about what we have to do now, that sort of thing. But anyway, I want to touch on the issue with you about security in Linux as compared to security in Apple or Microsoft. And you working on the server side of things, you're working with companies that have a lot of data, and people that if they got hacked, it would be very bad. And I wanted your take on that, because I have my opinions, which I have shared, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I am someone who's very digitally security focused, and in fact, the code I write, I'm always very careful about making sure it's locked down as tight as I can make it. And I see a lot of the mistakes that companies make, and it's like, ooh, that was such a novice mistake. So security is something that I always remind my friends and family and people I work with that it is a journey, not a destination. You can never, I don't care, Linux, BSD, Solaris, Windows, Mac, it doesn't matter. You never get to a point where it's like, okay, I'm there, I'm so totally secure. Because what the attackers can't do today, that doesn't mean they can't do it tomorrow. And so you need to keep that in mind. It is not that you never get to the point in digital security, because you read about Jeeps that drive, the Jeeps I'm talking about, that have like the Liberties and the Cherokees, they get hacked over the internet. I mean, they have been hacked over the internet. And so because they're the manufacturers are putting their cars online, which I think is a bad idea. So the same is true with Linux. You need to keep it up to date. And that's the key thing with anything. Any IoT, which is the Internet of Things, which is just your routers, your little smart meters, your smart thermostats, your smart microwave. Unfortunately, they need to be updated. And that is something that a lot of companies don't do. You go get they now have those refrigerators that aren't running Windows, they're running some form of Linux, and they have a little display on them so you can watch TV and they can hook up to your internet and they can tell you, hey, order more bread or get more bread or whatever. And so they're running Linux. But the thing there is they're not getting the updates. So with the easy Linux side of things, obviously is a desktop you get, or going and buying like you do, Joe, you go get a used laptop offline, or you go to a company like Micro Center that sells used laptops. That's another way, or desktops or whatever. You need to make sure you're keeping it updated, because some people will say, well, see, Linux got hacked or something like that. And it's like, yeah, they were using a version of Linux that was like 5 years old and had updates, but they hadn't applied the updates. So I have to do that a lot on the server side.
Yeah, that's a big thing. And the other thing is to understand is that one of the questions that I'm constantly asked, okay, I've just switched to Linux. Do I need to install antivirus? And
well, that I think depends. I mean, I know some people like yourself say no. If it gives you peace of mind, go ahead and do it. I mean, I don't really think anyone's going to it's not going to cause a huge issue. I mean, there's only something around like 60 meg. No, sorry, my screen started to go out there, so I lost train of thought there. But it's only about 60. I got to move my mouse, folks. But it's only about 60-ish known viruses for Linux. The rest are really more exploits because there's some software that should have been updated. There was already a known vulnerability in it. I wouldn't call that a virus. But as far as viruses go, something around there, around 60. Whereas Windows, there's like millions of them. So if it gives you some peace of mind, fine. If you're running like a Windows file server, it's very good to have it just so you can try and stop Windows viruses from spreading. So I think one of the better ones is ESET from Nod32 from my research, what I've done, because they're not all equal. But if you're just doing general stuff, I don't think as long as you're updating Linux, you're usually going to be okay, as long as you're not installing stuff that's way out of the repos, or, Google isn't always in the repos, but it's Google if you go to google.com. But I will say sometimes they get hacked. I mean, we saw Mint got hacked through its website. Wasn't that the Mint ISOs were compromised directly? They got compromised only because the website WordPress was not updated, and that's something.
Yeah, that was a WordPress. That was a WordPress issue, and but unfortunately, I still to this day have scratched my head trying to figure out how people got to the ISOs through WordPress. But
because WordPress can read to the. I mean, I don't know their infrastructure. Obviously, I don't work on their project, so I can't make direct comments. But WordPress, when you install it, it can read and write files to the actual website layout unless you set up in certain ways, and there are ways to kind of limit the damage. But my guess, just from the outside, they install WordPress. It was the same user, and you've seen that when Joe sets up stuff with Easy Linux. You set up a user, and the ISO was owned by the same user, or WordPress was running under, or it had some type of writable permissions that other users, like everyone could read, write to it or whatever. Although I'm guessing it may have even been uploaded for WordPress through, for all I know, I don't know. You could technically do that. So WordPress gets compromised all the time, folks. So that's why if you run your own website and you're running WordPress, update it when the new updates come out. I mean, if it takes you a day or two, fine. It's better if you can do it right away, but don't go weeks or months, and never go years without it. But that's true with Linux in general. I just want to be very clear about that.
Yeah, I mean,
people don't understand that.
My opinion always is, okay, if you have a Linux box and that Linux box is monolithic and it's not going to interact with a Windows file server, or you are not going to be sharing files back and forth with a Windows system a whole lot, then as long as you keep that OS up to date, and because that's why you'll notice you get the download all the time for a new Firefox and a new Chrome. And that's because they're finding vulnerabilities in there and they're closing the doors.
Most of the time that's true.
Yeah. And, sometimes it's feature updates and sometimes it's this and that. But, if you see those updates come up, you really need to make sure anything that gets on the internet needs to be updated regularly, which is email, and that is your browser and all that stuff. And one of the nice things about Linux, the way it does it, it makes it so much easier than having to do it on Windows, because installing updates to Firefox, Flash, all that other kind of stuff that you would have to do on Windows, usually involves opening up some installer, some kind of thing, downloading it, making sure you don't click the box that installs the crapware that goes along with it. Whereas with Linux, it all comes in one shot. It's like, okay, this is what's current. Bam, you install your updates, you're done. But one of the if you do have a lot of Windows files, one of the ones that I like a lot for antivirus on Linux is ClamAV, which if you do install it, it's not really going to help you much with Linux. But if you have a lot of Windows files, or you can also use ClamAV if you have a Windows machine that's trashed, it will go through and find everything that's even closely resembling a virus on that machine, and you can get rid of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that when you boot that machine back up after running ClamAV on it that it's going to work, because a lot of times when you remove viruses that operate, Windows just stops working. It's just they've trashed the system to the point where it doesn't make any difference. But yeah, that's another one is ClamAV. But in general, if you're installing Linux and it's going to be pretty much by itself, and you may have Windows running on another machine somewhere, you may have it in a dual boot, but you're not really going to be trading files back and forth. No, you really don't need to worry too much about it. But if you are, then ClamAV. What was that one? ESET?
ESET. I mean, ClamAV, though, those guys are not doing as good a job updating it these days as they used to, just so you know. It is an open source project. But one thing I will say, though, if you're dual booting, you need to keep in mind, depending on how it's done, Windows could potentially corrupt or start writing to your Linux environment. You never know.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I don't, this always causes controversy, but I just tell people, if you're going to do, I don't recommend a dual boot for somebody who doesn't understand how a computer works. And that's one of the things that I don't like about the Ubiquity installer for Ubuntu, and a lot of other systems do that as well, is that they offer to set up a dual boot with one click. And a lot of people who come to Linux for the first time, they go, well, I can have my cake and eat it too. And what they don't realize is that when you set up a dual boot, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to work the way it's supposed to. And then that can actually introduce problems that can bite you later on. And this Windows 10 anniversary update is a really good example. In certain situations, depending on how you have your dual boot set up, if you install that, it will blow out every other thing that you have on your computer. So Linux just goes bye-bye. And if you are not somebody who's real savvy about being able to repair a bootloader, either on Windows or on Linux, depending on which one, you may end up with a situation where you have a computer that won't work at all, won't do anything. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm kind of anti-dual boot. It opens up a lot of doors and it does a lot of things. I always prefer to have people, just if you can figure out how to do it, have Linux be on its own machine. Don't run it from an external hard drive. Don't run it, just install it on a computer, because then you're going to get the best experience with it. But there are clients that I have set dual boots up for, but with explaining to them, hey, this may not work and it might cause a problem, and so anyway.
I mean, if you really want to do that and you have the money not to afford a new computer, but you can buy a little bit of hardware, get a this is going to be technical, so for those who are more novices, you might not really, this is not going to make a lot of sense, but I do know there are people out there that do want to do this. What you'd want to do is get an external eSATA bay that would plug into your computer through eSATA if your computer has it. Then you can just drop in like your Linux drive and just keep it outside your computer, and when you're done using it, eject it, you take it out, you then pop in your Windows, and then they're physically isolated. But if you do that, ideally use SSD. You don't want to use USB. No. Don't get an external, or what's known as eSATA, because it will appear almost like an internal drive, but not USB in that case.
Right. It's just an extension on the SATA controller that's in the computer. In other words, your SATA controller might have 4. When you plug one of those things in, all of a sudden, now you got 6, or whatever it is.
I mean, then you're totally isolating it. But that does take some money, but it's not as much money usually as buying a whole new system. And the big caveat is if your computer has it, and a lot of laptops won't have eSATA controllers, especially lower end ones, but your computer might have an eSATA. If you can do that, then you're safer doing it that way, and then you just physically disconnect them. But be careful, folks, holding hard drives, because you can damage them if you discharge static electricity into them.
Yeah, handling a hard handling. It's one of the things I kind of like about SSDs. As long as you don't touch the actual plug on the end of it, most of the SSDs are completely encased, and so
They
just
are.
yeah. Whereas like spinning drives, you pull them out, and you can see that the controller circuit board is right there, and
Yep.
if you discharge some static on that, you could fry that drive. I've known people to do it. So always hold your hard drives by the edges and that sort of thing. Anytime that you're dealing with something like that. All right, man. Look, we have like gone on. This is amazing.
Yeah, we have, and
This is
we
the
do
first.
apologize. We always talk, Joe and I.
Yeah, this is the first. And what's cool about this is it's the first time out. So maybe we might want to consider doing this again. Of course, that is going to depend a great deal on your comments and suggestions to this video and whether anybody hung around to listen to it. We've gone on for quite some time now, and if you guys like this idea, put the comment down there. And using the Google Hangouts here seems to work out pretty good, and seems to be it's held itself together. So we, here on the Easy Linux channel, we might have some more guests as time rolls on here. And I know that I do have one person. I have a very good friend of mine that works for Commvault that I would like to bring in one time and do kind of like a roundtable if we can ever get the scheduling worked out. And for those of you who are more Linux savvy on the other end, know a little bit more about it, you might find that very interesting, especially, Mr. Cloud. We'll bring in Mr. We'll call that one Mr. Desktop, Mr. Server, and Mr. Cloud. And we'll bring everybody in and we'll just talk. So before we wrap this up, is there anything in particular that you wanted to say? Any last comments, thoughts, whatever?
Well, obviously, just keep running Linux. I mean, you can expand it, and it fits so many niches. So
yeah, and
I think. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I think it's the answer to a vast majority of computing problems. And if you're still stuck on Windows, don't beat yourself up. We understand. I mean, there's certain cases that it's just going to take a little bit of time for the tools to get out there, but it's more and more people are now able to switch to Linux today than they were 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, even more and more people will be. And so you may be sitting there, like Joe said, right on that edge and say, but there's just this one piece of software that I must have for my business, or I have to have for whatever reason. I don't know. You're just attached to Grand Theft Auto on the PC. I don't even know if they make it for the PC, but we understand. We're not saying, and just keep checking out Joe's channel and learning more about Linux, and you'll get there.
And also in the description for this video, I'm going to have a link to Cyber Solutions, their website. So that would be how you would get a hold of Jeremy if you got really excited, if you have a small business and you want a little advice and maybe some get him to help you set up doing, switching over from like an old Windows network to something like that. This is something that he does all the time for lots of different clients. And your rates are reasonable, aren't they?
Yeah, I also help a lot of people. Really, what I do more than anything, just so people know, is web-based stuff. So if you have a website, you do with WordPress, or really anything setting up from new servers to, especially web servers, to. I do go to clients sometimes, and I have done that, as you mentioned, and I've switched some people and clients to Linux. I also do really more heavily even on the website. So,
right. So yeah, that's just to make sure
PHP.
that clear. Mm-hmm. PHP, and you write in what programming languages do you write in?
PHP and Perl, although Perl not as much these days, mainly PHP. I know there's some people who don't like PHP and Python and some others, but I really focus at this point more on PHP. I know it does have some limitations, but in general, it's what Facebook runs in. It's what runs Wikipedia. Those are obviously not small, nothing sites. And you can get it to scale with the right solutions, which I do understand how to get a lot of things to scale really well.
Okay, that's very cool. And so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. And thank you very much for those of you who are hanging out listening. And like I said, I don't know when we will do this again or put it on some kind of regular schedule, or this is really just an experiment. But I think I feel like it went really well. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, other than just obviously we talk, as we always, Joe and I do, as he said, we just like to just go on and on and on. But we're both passionate about Linux. And so when you get us both talking about Linux, it's hard to get us to stop. So, I mean, I'm open if anyone has any, would like to have us get back on, if there's any specific questions. I mean, some things obviously are just, more lend themselves to more one-on-one. And I can help a little bit out, but obviously I stay pretty busy. So if you throw questions my way, I'll do my best to answer it, but I can't
Yeah,
obviously calm.
do keep that in mind. I mean, I run into that with Easy Linux as well. Is that, you know, I'm very happy to if somebody has a specific question about something, but you know, the thing about it is that at some point you're going to have to hire us.
Yeah, I mean, I got servers I have to set up and redo email systems and programs. I got so many program things on my to-do list. So, I mean, I'm not saying I won't answer you or anything like that, but you know, I can't obviously, you know, handhold everything without getting some paid support, you know, indefinitely, because obviously I have to do stuff for our company as well as other clients we have. But you know, I mean, if you have something or you just want to fill me out or talk to me, and I appreciate you listening to this. If you made it this far, thank you. And
Yeah, thank
you know,
you.
just let us know. Just let us
All
know.
right.
I appreciate. Thank you, Joe, for having me on your channel. And you know, again, just let us know what you thought of this, and we'll see what happens in the future.
We'll see what happens next. You know, this is an alternative. And before I wrap it up, I do want to remind you that in the description to this video, not only will you be able to get to the CyberWeb Solutions website, but also there are links there to Easy Linux on the web, Easy Linux on Facebook. And if you do check that out, give it a like. Also, check out freedompenguin.com for lots of great articles about Linux. And I think we're just about done. We're going to wrap this up. So I'm going to say good night, Joe, and you can say good night, Jeremy.
Good night, Jeremy.